In this module, we're going to discuss corporate entrepreneurship. That is, entrepreneurial principles applied within the context of an established and possibly mature organisation. We can adapt the definition of entrepreneurship that we've seen before to the corporate context. It simply means the pursuit of opportunity within an established organisation without depending on the resources you currently control. The distinction here is, of course, corporates have more resources at their disposal. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be prepared to invest those resources in a startup within the context of the corporate organisation. The intrapreneur, the person within the company who wants to get those resources to use to pursue a new business opportunity, is usually going to have to negotiate with the people within the company that control those resources. Contrasting corporate entrepreneurship with startups. We've seen this definition before from Lean Startup, temporary organisation designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. Steve Blank expanded on this to say that a company is a permanent organisation designed to execute a repeatable and scalable business model. The difference between these two definitions represents a conflict of interest which is at the heart of corporate entrepreneurship. A company becomes good at executing a proven business model. A startup is inherently designed to look for a different business model, and the two are often in conflict. And this is why startups often face a lot of resistance within the context of an established business. There are various models of corporate entrepreneurship, and here is one of them, and it defines different styles. So it can be involving a new business, a corporate venture. So in other words, an existing company starts a new business, usually under a different name, possibly under somewhat independent ownership, so it's distinct from the parent company. Or new ideas are developed within the existing company, and Pinchot was the first person to call this intrapreneurship. So intra means within. Or, and this one is often overlooked in the definitions, where an entrepreneurial philosophy permeates an entire organisation's outlook and operations. So in other words, the company is intrinsically entrepreneurial. And this, I guess, is what startups that grow fast, such as Google and Amazon and eBay and companies like that, what they aim to continue to be. And from the same article, Forms of Corporate Entrepreneurship talks about what we often think of as just innovation, a firm that continuously introduces new products and services or enters new markets. In other words, it's always evolving. Rejuvenation is a little bit different. It means that the company changes the way it does things in order to give itself a competitive advantage in some way, and that can be very entrepreneurial and very successful, but also very hard to do. Another one, strategic reward, is basically a new business strategy that is based on its capabilities and resources. So in other words, something that allows you to do what you do best and at the same time pursue a new opportunity. Domain redefinition, entering a new product market arena where it can enter as a pioneer. Now, startups like to do this as well, and one of the challenges that corporates have is that startups have less constraints on what they can do. They don't have a brand reputation, they don't have existing customers, they don't have market expectations. So they will often enter new market spaces, but corporates can do it too. You could argue, for example, that Apple did this first with the iPod, even though it wasn't a new space. They basically defined that market so that they became the dominant brand. And similarly with the smartphone, again, they weren't the first ones into that space, but when they entered it, they owned it for quite some time. Here's another way of looking at it, and it results in 4 models. So it looks at 2 dimensions, one of which is who owns entrepreneurship within the organisation. Is it owned at a high level? Is it a designated group, or is it something that just happens ad hoc because of individuals, or everybody's expected to be part of it? Then there's who has the authority, and that usually means the money or the allocation of resources. Is there a pool of money put aside for entrepreneurial innovative projects, or do people have to negotiate for it ad hoc? So putting that together, you get your good old 4-quadrant model. And here are the 4 quadrants, each of them with their own name. The enabler with dedicated resources and diffused ownership, etc. I'm going to describe each of these in more detail in the following slides. First of all, the opportunist model, which is often where businesses start out on their journey of being more entrepreneurial. So it's ad hoc. In other words, somebody comes up with a good idea and has to negotiate for the resources. So there's no strategy of entrepreneurship. In order for this to work, there has to be a certain amount of flexibility and openness to experimentation, which means also openness to failure. So it's not a deliberate strategy, and if it's successful, then it can well lead to one of the other models because people start to see the benefits. The enabler model. This is a deliberate strategy where there's dedicated funding, but there's diffused ownership. So in other words, if somebody has a good idea, then they can pitch to the people who control the money about why they should get investment to pursue that idea. Again, it requires a fair amount of freedom, and some companies will specifically say you've got 10 to 20% of free time to work on whatever you're interested in. And it needs people who have got that sort of inquiring spirit to actually get value out of it. One of the classic examples of this is Google, of course, who have gone from being a search engine to advertising, email maps, collaborative documents, and who knows where they'll go next. Self-driving cars. Hey, where did that come from? Other pioneers of this approach, 3M, the inventors of the Post-it note, that company has been around for, it must be about 100 years now, and it's continued to innovate throughout its life. An Australian example, which you may not have heard of, but if you haven't and you're interested in technology entrepreneurship, look them up. Semco is a really interesting Brazilian company where they have a very, very self-organizing structure, and it has evolved in a really interesting way, well worth looking at. The advocate model involves ad hoc funding but focused ownership. So the idea is to transform, and what happens here is that the funding is made available when somebody at the top of the organisation deems that it's appropriate, but there's no organised pool of funds. So for example, if you're familiar with the Virgin Group of companies, and if you've read any of Richard Branson's books or interviews with him, he's very clear on if somebody in the Virgin Group comes up with an idea for a new business, they can come to his management team and explain it to them, and if they think it sounds good, then they'll give them money to go off and try that business. And they won't judge them if they fail. He expects some of them to fail. So that's an example of an advocate model. If you are an advocate for entrepreneurship within the company, you can go and get funds. Then the producer model, this is, if you like, the industrialised entrepreneurship. There's dedicated funding, there's focused ownership, and there is usually a very clear process for taking ideas up through the stages. So in other words, there might be an innovation scheme where people can come up with ideas, and they will progressively go to the next stage of funding and investment of resources until the best ones are actually launched onto the market. So the example in the article is Cargill, which is a conglomerate company. IBM have been pretty good at this as well. They started off as a hardware manufacturer. They're now high-end consultants and business solution providers. Deloitte Digital. Deloitte is a big consultancy company, but Deloitte Digital was founded by one of their Australian managers. And this is, of course, what Kodak should have done about digital photography. but unfortunately they missed that boat. So does this model help? I've probably said this to you before, and I'll probably say it again. All models are wrong. All models are approximations of reality, and therefore they're inherently wrong, but some are useful. So ask yourself as you see a model, does this help me to understand what goes on in the real world? If I look at that 4-quadrant model, for example, and I go, oh yeah, I think this company that I've been looking at actually is using that approach, and recognize the limitations. Okay, so that's about corporate entrepreneurship, but what about being the entrepreneur within the corporate environment? It's not easy. This comes from a book by Karatko on entrepreneurship. Karatko is a bit of a specialist in corporate entrepreneurship. So what it really amounts to is you need to be prepared to take risks. Come to work every day willing to give up your job for the innovation. You've got to care about it, otherwise it'll be much easier to do what your job description says. Circumvent bureaucratic orders. In other words, try and avoid the rules that will stop you from doing what you want to do. If somebody in a position of authority says, stop doing that or you will lose your job, you might have to pay attention, but otherwise interpret the rules in your favour. Yes, ignore your job description, do what you need to make the innovation work. If you stick within your job description, you are unlikely to be an entrepreneur. You need a team because you can't do this on your own. So there's a team that will work with you to do it, but you also need ultimately somebody who is above you and has more authority in the organisation to help you. So it's a good idea to keep your innovation underground until you've found that person. Which comes to point 6. Find someone at a senior level who believes in what you're doing and will sponsor you, will stand up for you, and will argue that you need to be given the time or the resources or whatever to make this work. You've probably heard the phrase, ask for forgiveness rather than for permission. Best thing to do is assume that you are allowed to do something until told otherwise. Be realistic. Just like a startup venture involves finding ways to overcome problems, the same thing applies in corporate entrepreneurship. So be realistic. If the first thing you try doesn't work, try something else. Share the glory. Again, this is exactly the same as an individual entrepreneur. Distribute the rewards and convey the innovation's vision through the strong venture plan. Another way of putting this would be sell the upside. If you're trying to get commitment from within the organisation to making this happen, then it's important that you can describe to them what benefit they'll get, how much money can this bring in, how many new customers can they get, how will this help them to build pathways into new markets beyond just the product or service that you're working on. That's what management likes. So, some of the keys to success in making corporate entrepreneurship work is that if you have early successes, even if they're small, it helps to build confidence that this can actually work. Now, that means that you also have to have tolerance for change, and you have to be prepared to accept a certain amount of stress because things will go wrong. And a corporate entrepreneurial company has to have a culture that values and nurtures innovation. It's essential for success, and it's also rare. What tends to happen with innovation is that it's regarded as a nice to have and not part of the core business, which means that when times get tough, maybe there's a downturn in the economy, maybe the market is threatened by a competitor overseas or a new innovation, then companies tend to want to revert back to core business. And that's a real challenge for consistently practicing corporate entrepreneurship. So why would companies try to do this? Well, they realise that the business environment is getting more and more challenging. Competitors arrive more quickly. new technologies evolve, customers are very well informed and they change their preferences. So they need to keep innovating to survive, which means they need to employ innovators. They need more corporate entrepreneurs, and they need the organisational culture to support them. They recognise that entrepreneurs think differently and that they need people within their organisation who have a bias for action and can work out how to do things quickly and with minimum resources. And it's hard. So one idea that was discussed between the pioneer of Steve Blank, Lean Startup, a guy called Alex Osterwalder, who invented the business model canvas, and Henry Chesbrough, who is a pioneer of what's called open innovation. They got together and discussed that a chief corporate entrepreneur could be a good idea. If you want to watch that video, there's a link to it on the Blackboard site. It's only a couple of minutes. So takeaways from this module. Corporate entrepreneurship presents an inherent conflict with business as usual. So it needs high-level support within the organisation, otherwise it will almost certainly fail. There are different forms. For example, it could be continuous innovation of products and services. It could be starting up new businesses under the parent's ownership, or it could be rejuvenating the organisation. And finally, corporate entrepreneurs, otherwise known as intrapreneurs, need to be very much like independent entrepreneurs. They need to be prepared to take risks and to back their ideas with all those 10D characteristics that we talked about before, but they also need to be skilled at organisational politics, which is simply understanding the demands and the key performance indicators that other people in the organisation are operating under, and work out how to help them win if you win. Really interesting topic. I hope you enjoy the readings that are available on Blackboard about this.